My daughter took my social security check and went off to the beach, leaving me in the house with no food and no money and no warning. She came back days later acting like nothing had happened. And that moment was when something inside me finally broke, even though I stayed quiet on the outside. I am a black woman in my late 60s living in a small house on the south side of Atlanta, and that check was all I had to get me through the month. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that morning staring at the empty counter and the quiet room around me. The refrigerator was almost empty, and the cabinets were down to a few cans I had been saving just in case. I kept telling myself she would come back soon, and that there had to be a reason. I raised my daughter on my own after her father passed, and I worked hard every single year until my body could not do it anymore. That social security check was not extra money. It was my rent money, my food money, my medicine money. I trusted her because she was my child, and because I believed family should never put you in a position like that. When she took the check, she said she just needed to borrow it for a day. She said she would be right back, and that she would make it up to me. I watched her grab her bag and walk out the door, and I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the sound of her car leaving the street. The first night I told myself it was fine. I made some toast and drank water, and went to bed early to keep my mind busy. The second day I started to worry, but I still did not call anyone because I did not want to embarrass her or myself. By the third day my stomach hurt, and my head felt light, and I knew something was wrong. I checked my phone over and over, and there were no messages from her. No calls, no apologies. I felt small sitting in my own house, wondering how my own child could forget about me like that. I kept thinking about all the times I went without, so she could have more when she was growing up. On the fourth day she finally came back. She walked in smiling with sand still in her shoes and sun on her skin. She talked about the beach like it was a normal weekend trip, and not something she paid for with my survival. She did not even look at the empty kitchen. I asked her where my money was, and she told me to relax. She said she had fun and needed a break, and that I was always worrying too much. She said she would give it back when she could, and that I should not make a big deal out of it. Felt something tighten in my chest when she said that. I wanted to yell and cry, and ask her how she could do that to me. Instead, I stayed seated and listened because I had spent years keeping the peace in this house. Her boyfriend was in the other room playing music loud like he owned the place, and that made it worse. I realized in that moment that I was no longer being seen as her mother. I was being treated like a wallet and a place to stay. I looked around my own living room and felt like a guest in my own life. That night I could not sleep. I lay in my bed thinking about how many lines had been crossed, and how long I had been making excuses for her behavior. I thought about my age and my health, and how much longer I could keep living like this. I knew something had to change, even if I was scared to admit it. The next morning, I sat up and made a decision quietly without telling anyone. I did not know yet what I was going to do, but I knew I could not let this keep happening. I owed myself more than that. That was the beginning of everything. I woke up that next morning, feeling tired in a way sleep could not fix, and my body felt heavier than usual as I sat on the edge of the bed trying to gather my thoughts. The house was loud even though no one was talking, because the tension had settled into the walls and I could feel it everywhere I walked. I went into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator again, even though I already knew what was inside. A little milk that was about to turn, and a few leftovers that would not last the day. I stood there longer than I needed to, and closed the door slowly because it felt like closing it on myself. My daughter was still asleep on the couch when I walked past her. Her phone was in her hand, and her shoes were kicked off like she had no worries at all. I watched her chest rise and fall, and I felt a mix of love and hurt that made my eyes burn. I kept reminding myself she was my child, but that reminder was starting to feel like a weight. Later that morning she woke up and acted like everything was normal. She turned the television on loud and laughed at something on the screen, while I sat at the table counting the days, until the next check would come. I asked her again about my money, and she sighed like I was bothering her. She told me she would handle it, and that I needed to stop stressing her out. She said she was going through a lot and needed support instead of pressure. I listened to her words and realized she had turned the situation around on me, and somehow, I was the problem now. Her boyfriend came into the kitchen and opened the cabinets without asking. He took the last can of soup and heated it up like it belonged to him. I watched him eat it, standing over the sink, and he did not even say thank you. That was when my hands started shaking. I went back to my room and closed the door. I sat on my bed and tried to slow my breathing. I thought about calling someone, but I did not know who to call. I was ashamed to admit I had let things get this bad, and that shame kept me quiet. All afternoon I stayed in my room, listening to them move around the house. Their laughter felt sharp and careless. I kept thinking about how I had worked my whole life to have a safe place, and now I felt trapped inside it. As evening came, my daughter knocked on my door and told me not to be dramatic. She said I was making her feel guilty for no reason, and that hurt more than anything else she had said. I realized she did not see my hunger or my fear. She only saw inconvenience. That night I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. I thought about how much longer I could live like this, and what would happen if I got sick or fell. I knew I could not depend on her anymore, and that truth settled deep inside me. Somewhere between midnight and morning, I made another quiet promise to myself. I would start paying attention. I would stop pretending this was temporary. I did not know the steps yet, but I knew this was no longer just about money. It was about my dignity. The next few days blurred together, and each one felt longer than the last as I moved through the house trying to stay out of the way. I ate very little and drank water to quiet the hunger, and I told myself I had lived through worse, even though I knew I should not have to live like this now. My daughter kept saying she was working on getting my money back, but her words never turned into action. She spent hours on her phone laughing and scrolling while I sat nearby listening and waiting. Every time I looked at her, I remembered the little girl she used to be, and that memory made it harder to accept who she was becoming. One afternoon, I asked her calmly when I could expect the check back. She rolled her eyes and told me I was obsessed with money. She said family should help each other, and that I was being selfish. Hearing that made my stomach drop because I realized she truly believed what she was saying. Her boyfriend stayed around more often and acted more comfortable each day. He left his shoes in the hallway and his clothes on the chair. He talked over me when I spoke and laughed when I stayed quiet. I felt invisible in my own home, and that hurt in a way I had never felt before. I went into the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror that night. My face looked tired and older than I remembered. I thought about how much strength it took just to keep standing and how little respect I was getting in return. I asked myself how I had let things get this far. I thought about the years. I worked 2 jobs and came home exhausted, but still made dinner and helped with homework. I thought about the nights I stayed up worrying about bills so my daughter could sleep without fear. Those memories did not make me proud in that moment. They made me sad. That evening my daughter left again without telling me where she was going. I sat alone in the quiet house listening to the clock tick and feeling the weight of the silence. I realized I was scared not just of being hungry, but of being abandoned right in front of someone who should care. Decided then that I needed help even if asking for it made me uncomfortable. I found an old notebook and wrote down everything that had happened so far. Writing it out made it real. And once it was real, I could not ignore it anymore. I did not confront her that night. I stayed quiet and observed. I watched how easily she dismissed me, and how quickly she moved on with her life. I knew this situation was not going to fix itself. As I lay in bed later, I felt a mix of fear and clarity. I did not know what the next step would be, but I knew I was done waiting. Something was coming and I could feel it building inside me. The morning after that, I woke up with a strange calm inside me, like something had settled into place even though nothing around me had changed. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house, and I could hear my daughter moving around in the kitchen like it was any other day. Got dressed slowly and walked out to the living room. She was on the phone laughing and pacing back and forth. She did not acknowledge me at all, and I stood there for a moment waiting to see if she would look up. She did not. That small moment hurt more than a loud argument would have. I went into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I noticed there was no food left at all now. No bread. No soup. Nothing. I felt my chest tighten and my hands grip the counter as I tried to stay steady. This was no longer just uncomfortable. This was dangerous. When she finally ended her call, I asked her again about my money. I kept my voice calm and even. She looked at me like I was interrupting something important. She said she had plans and could not deal with this right now. She told me I was stressing her out again. That was when I realized she was not going to change because she did not think she had done anything wrong. She had already justified it in her mind, and there was nothing I could say that would undo that. The realization was painful, but it was also clear that her boyfriend came in and stood close to her like backup. He did not say anything, but the look on his face told me everything. I felt small standing there between them, and I hated that feeling more than anything else. I went back to my room and closed the door. I sat on my bed and stared at the wall for a long time. I thought about what could happen if I got sick or needed help and no one was there for me. I thought about how easily I could disappear in this house, and no one would notice. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. I stopped on a number I had not called in years. It was a local senior support office that had helped my neighbor once. My finger hovered over the screen, and I hesitated because asking for help felt like admitting failure. After a few minutes, I pressed the call button. A woman answered and spoke kindly to me. I told her my situation slowly and quietly. I told her about the money and the food, and the way I was being treated. She listened without interrupting, and that alone made me feel less invisible. She told me I had options and that what was happening was not right. Hearing that from someone outside my home made my eyes fill with tears. For the first time in days, I felt like I was not crazy for feeling the way I did. When I ended the call, I sat there holding my phone. I knew I had crossed a line I could not uncross. I had asked for help, and that meant things were going to change, whether my daughter liked it or not. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling again. My heart was beating fast, but my mind felt clear. Whatever came next, I knew I would face it head on. After that phone call, everything felt sharper, like I was finally seeing my life without a fog over it. I moved through the rest of the day, slowly paying attention to every sound and every look. My daughter stayed distant and avoided me, and I could feel the space growing wider between us. That evening she left the house again with her boyfriend. She did not tell me where they were going, and she did not ask if I needed anything. I watched them walk out and heard the door close behind them, and I realized how used to that sound I had become. This time I did not cry. I just sat down and waited. I turned the television on low and tried to distract myself, but my mind kept going back to the woman on the phone and the way she said I had options. I repeated those words quietly to myself like a promise. I had spent so long believing I had no choice that the idea of options felt almost unreal. The next morning, I got up early and gathered my paperwork. I found old bank statements, medical bills, and letters I had kept in a drawer. I laid them out on the bed and organized them the best I could. Doing that made me feel like I was taking control again, even if it was just a small step. My daughter woke up and saw the papers spread out. She asked what I was doing, and I told her I was getting my things in order. She laughed and said I was being dramatic again. She told me I was overreacting, and that everything would work out if I would just calm down. I looked at her and realized how far apart we were standing even though we were in the same room. I told her quietly that taking my check and leaving me with no food was not something I could ignore anymore. She got defensive right away and said I was trying to make her look bad. Her boyfriend stepped in and told me I needed to mind my business. Hearing that in my own house made my stomach turn. I felt my hands shake again, but this time I did not back down. I told him this was my home and my money, and that he had no right to speak to me that way. The room went quiet after that. My daughter stared at me like she did not recognize me. I did not raise my voice and I did not insult her. I simply told the truth, and that seemed to shock her more than anger would have. She walked away shaking her head and slammed the bedroom door. I stood there alone for a moment, feeling both scared and strong at the same time. Speaking up had cost me peace, but it had also given me something back. That afternoon I made another call to the support office. They helped me set up an appointment to talk in person. When I hung up the phone, I felt nervous but determined. I knew I was stepping into something unknown, but I also knew staying silent was no longer an option. That night as I lay in bed, I felt tired but resolved. I did not know how my daughter would react in the days to come, but I knew I was done shrinking myself to keep her comfortable. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The next day, I woke up before the sun and lay still listening to the house while everything was quiet. That quiet felt different now. It was not peaceful, but it was honest. I knew something had shifted, and I could not pretend anymore. Got dressed and gathered my purse and papers, and waited for the time of my appointment. My daughter stayed in her room and did not speak to me. I could hear her moving around, but there was a wall between us that had not been there before. I felt sad about that, but I also knew I could not fix it by giving in again. When it was time to leave, I walked out the front door alone. I locked it behind me and stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath. I had not gone anywhere by myself in a long time, and that small act made me feel nervous and strong at the same time. The office was in a small building not far from my neighborhood. The woman I spoke to on the phone met me at the door and led me into a quiet room. She asked me to sit and tell her everything from the beginning. I spoke slowly and carefully, and I did not leave anything out. As I talked, I felt my throat tighten, but I kept going. I told her about the check and the beach trip and the days without food. I told her about the way my daughter spoke to me and how her boyfriend treated me in my own house. Saying it out loud made it real in a way that hurt, but it also made it clear. She listened without judgment and took notes. When I finished, she looked at me and said what I had been feeling was justified. She said taking my money and leaving me without food was abuse. Hearing that word made my chest tighten, but it also made sense. She explained my options slowly. She talked about protecting my income and my housing. She talked about boundaries and legal steps and support programs. I did not understand everything, but I understood enough to know I was not powerless. When I left the office, my hands were shaking, but my mind felt steady. I walked back to the bus stop and sat down watching people pass by. No one knew what I had just done, but I felt like I had crossed an important line. When I got home, my daughter waiting for me. She asked where I had been, and I told her I had gone to get help. Her face changed when I said that. She accused me of trying to get her in trouble and of betraying her. I stayed calm and told her I was trying to survive. I told her I needed my money back and I needed to feel safe in my own home. She raised her voice and said I was overreacting and embarrassing her. I did not argue back. I told her I had made my decision and that things were going to change. Saying that out loud felt scary, but it also felt true. I walked past her and went into my room and closed the door. That night I sat on my bed holding my purse and papers. I knew the next steps would not be easy, and I knew there would be consequences. But I also knew I had chosen myself for the first time in a long while. And that choice was not something I could take back. The tension in the house did not fade after that conversation. It settled deeper and heavier, like something sitting on my chest every time I walked into a room. My daughter barely spoke to me, and when she did, her words were sharp and defensive, like she was preparing for a fight that I no longer wanted to have. The next few days felt like walking on broken glass. I stayed mostly in my room and only came out when I needed water or to use the bathroom. I kept my purse close to me at all times because it held my papers and the little sense of control I had left. I no longer trusted leaving anything unattended. One afternoon I noticed food in the kitchen again, but it was not for me. My daughter cooked for herself and her boyfriend and left the mess behind. I watched them eat and laugh while I drank water and tried to quiet my stomach. That hurt, but it also confirmed what I already knew. I was no longer being considered. That evening, my daughter finally spoke to me. She asked me if I had called anyone else. Her tone was suspicious and angry. I told her I had spoken to people who were helping me understand my rights. She said I was trying to destroy her life and that everything she did was for us. Asked her how going to the beach with my check helped me survive. She did not answer that. She turned away and said I was twisting things and acting like a victim. Hearing that made something inside me go still. I realized she could not see me clearly anymore. Later that night, her boyfriend confronted me directly. He stood in the doorway of my room and told me I needed to stop causing problems. He said this was their house now, and that I should be grateful they let me stay. My heart started racing when he said that. But I did not let him see my fear, told him calmly that this was my house and my income, and that I would not be intimidated. My voice shook, but I kept speaking. I told him he needed to leave me alone. He laughed and walked away, like none of it mattered. After that, I locked my bedroom door for the first time since my daughter moved back in. Sitting on my bed behind that locked door made me feel both ashamed and alert. I never imagined needing to protect myself from my own child and the man she brought into my home. I called the support office again the next morning and told them what had happened. They took it seriously and told me to document everything. They told me I was doing the right thing by protecting myself. Hearing that helped me breathe a little easier. As the day went on, I started writing again in my notebook. I wrote down dates, times, and words that were said. I wrote down how I felt in my body and how often I felt afraid. Putting it on paper made it harder to deny the truth. That night I lay in bed listening to the noise in the living room, and I realized I was no longer waiting for things to get better on their own. I was preparing myself for what needed to happen next. I did not know exactly how it would unfold, but I knew this situation was reaching a breaking point. The next morning, I woke up with my jaw tight and my back aching from another restless night. I lay there for a few seconds listening to the house and trying to decide if it was safe to come out of my room. That thought alone told me how bad things had become. When I finally opened the door, I saw the living room was a mess again. Empty cups on the table, food wrappers on the floor, the television loud even though no one was watching it. I stood there taking it in and felt a wave of anger rise, but I pushed it down and kept moving. I went into the kitchen hoping maybe there would be something left for me to eat. There was not. I opened every cabinet and the refrigerator and then closed them one by one. My hands were shaking and my head felt light. I leaned against the counter and waited for the feeling to pass. My daughter came in while I was standing there. She looked at me and asked why I was standing like that. I told her calmly that there was no food again, and that I had not eaten properly in days. She rolled her eyes and said I should have told her earlier. Her words felt careless and dismissive. I reminded her that I had told her many times and that she had taken my money. She snapped back that she was tired of hearing about the check, that I needed to move on. Hearing that made my chest hurt. I realized she expected me to just accept this and be quiet. Her boyfriend walked in behind her and laughed when he saw my face. He said something under his breath that I could not fully hear, but I knew it was not kind. I felt small standing there between them, and I hated that feeling more than hunger. I went back to my room and closed the door. I sat on the bed and pressed my hands into my knees, trying to ground myself. I knew I could not stay like this much longer. My body was warning me, and I needed to listen. That afternoon, I made another call to the support office and told them things were getting worse. They asked me if I felt safe. I hesitated before answering, and that hesitation said more than words. They told me they would help me take the next steps. They explained that I could protect my income and that I did not have to allow anyone to live in my home who was harming me. Hearing that made my heart race. The idea of taking legal steps against my own daughter felt heavy and painful. After the call, I sat quietly for a long time. I thought about the little girl she used to be, and the woman she was now. I thought about my own health, and how fragile it felt lately. I knew love did not mean allowing myself to be destroyed. That night I packed a small bag with clothes and my papers. I hid it in the closet just in case. As I lay down to sleep, I knew I was getting closer to a decision that would change everything. I did not feel ready, but I felt certain. I barely slept that night, and when morning came my body felt weak and slow, like it was asking me to stop pretending everything was fine. I sat up in bed and waited for the dizziness to pass before standing. That scared me because I knew it was from not eating enough and from stress that had been building for weeks. Moved carefully through the house and tried not to make noise. My daughter and her boyfriend were still asleep on the couch, and the television was playing to an empty room. I turned it down slowly and walked into the kitchen. I filled a glass with water and drank it standing at the sink, because my legs felt unsteady. Looked around the kitchen and saw how far things had fallen. This was once a place where I cooked meals and talked and laughed. Now it felt careless and used. I realized then that even if my money came back, nothing else would go back to how it was before. When my daughter woke up later that morning, she was in a bad mood. She asked me why the television was turned down and accused me of trying to control her. I told her quietly that I was not trying to control anything. I just needed peace and safety. She laughed and said I was being dramatic again. I felt something inside me finally settle. Not anger. Not sadness. Acceptance. I understood that she was not going to hear me no matter how gently I spoke. I stopped trying to explain myself, and that changed the energy between us right away. That afternoon, I received a call from the support office. They told me they could help me with an emergency food program and legal guidance. They asked if I could come in again the next day. I said yes without hesitation. Saying yes felt like choosing life. When I hung up, my daughter asked who I was talking to. I told her calmly that I was getting help. She told me I was overreacting and ruining everything. I did not respond. I went into my room and closed the door. I sat on my bed and opened my notebook and read through what I had written. Seeing it all in one place made it impossible to deny. The hunger, the fear, the disrespect. I realized this was no longer about fixing a relationship. It was about protecting myself. That evening, I packed my bag again and placed it by the door of my room. I made sure my papers and my identification were inside. I felt like I was preparing for something serious, and that scared me, but it also made me feel responsible for myself. As night came, I lay down and stared at the ceiling. I thought about how many times I had stayed quiet to avoid conflict. I understood now that silence had cost me too much. Tomorrow I would take another step, and there would be no turning back after that. I closed my eyes, knowing that whatever came next would be hard. But staying where I was would be harder. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm and sat on the edge of the bed holding my bag in my lap. My body felt tired, but my mind was steady in a way I had not felt before. I washed my face slowly and looked at myself in the mirror. I saw fear there, but I also saw resolve, and that mattered more. I did not say anything when I walked past the living room. My daughter and her boyfriend were still asleep, and the television was playing to no one. I opened the front door quietly and stepped outside. The air felt cool and clean, and I took a deep breath before locking the door behind me. I made my way back to the support office, and this time I did not feel lost walking in. The same woman greeted me and led me into a small room. She asked how things had been since we last spoke, and I told her everything without holding back. I told her about the food being gone again, and about the confrontation with the boyfriend, and about how unsafe I felt in my own home. She listened carefully, and then explained things to me in clear, simple terms. She told me that what was happening was financial abuse and emotional abuse. She told me I had the right to protect my income and my space. She said loving your child does not mean allowing yourself to be harmed. She helped me fill out paperwork to make sure my social security check would no longer be accessible to anyone else. Watching my name on those forms made me feel like I was taking my life back one piece at a time. It was slow, but it was real. Then she talked to me about my house. She explained that I was the owner, and that no one had the right to take over my space or intimidate me there. She said there were legal steps I could take to remove people who were hurting me, even if they were family. Hearing that made my chest tight, but I knew she was right. She asked me if I had somewhere safe to stay if things became worse. I told her I could stay with a friend for a short time if I had to. She nodded and said that was good to have a plan. She reminded me that safety came first, and that I did not have to face everything alone. When I left the office, I felt drained but clear. I sat on a bench outside for a while and let everything sink in. I thought about how hard it was to admit I needed help, and how much strength it actually took to do that. I realized I had been strong all along. I just had not been using that strength for myself. When I returned home later that day, my daughter waiting. She asked me where I had been, and her tone was sharp. I told her calmly that I had gone to take care of my affairs. She demanded to know what that meant. I told her my money would no longer be touched by anyone else. Her face changed immediately. She started yelling and said I was selfish and cruel. She said I was trying to control her life and ruin her plans. I stayed still and let her speak. I noticed how quickly her anger came when she lost access to my resources. Her boyfriend joined in and told me I was making a mistake. He said I would regret pushing them away. I felt my heart pounding, but I kept my voice calm. I told them this was my home and my income, and I would not be threatened. The argument did not last long because I stopped engaging. I went into my room and closed the door. I packed my bag the rest of the way and made sure everything important was inside. I knew I might need to leave soon, and I wanted to be ready. That evening I called a close friend and told her the truth. I told her I might need a place to stay for a little while. She did not judge me or question me. She told me I could come anytime and that I was not a burden. Hearing that made my eyes fill with tears. As night came, I sat on my bed and looked around my room. This space had been my refuge for years, and now even it felt uncertain. I felt sad about that, but I did not feel defeated. I knew this was part of doing what was right. Before I lay down, I wrote one more thing in my notebook. I wrote that choosing myself was not an act of betrayal. It was an act of survival. I closed the notebook and placed it in my bag. That night I slept lightly but without regret. I knew the next steps would be harder and more painful. But I also knew I had already crossed the hardest line. I was no longer willing to disappear in my own life. The next day arrived heavy and quiet, and I could feel it in my chest before my feet even touched the floor. I moved slowly through my morning routine and kept my bag close to me because it had become a kind of anchor. Everything important to me was inside it now, and that felt both strange and sad. My daughter barely looked at me when she woke up. She moved around the house with sharp energy, slamming cabinets and muttering under her breath. I stayed calm and stayed out of her way. I was no longer trying to fix her mood or soften her anger. I was protecting my own peace. Her boyfriend came in later and acted like nothing had happened. He turned the television up loud and took over the living room like he always did. I watched him for a moment and realized how normal this had become to me, and how wrong that was. That realization hurt, but it also pushed me forward. I went into my room and sat on the bed, and thought about what the woman at the office had told me. She said safety comes first. She said dignity matters. Those words stayed with me as I picked up my phone and made another call. This time it was to a legal aid office she had recommended. The woman who answered asked me simple questions and listened carefully. I explained my situation and told her about the money and the food, and the way I was being treated. She told me I had legal rights and that there were steps I could take to remove people from my home if they were harming me. Hearing that made my hands shake, but it also made me feel seen. She explained the process slowly so I could understand it. She told me it would not be easy, and it would not feel good, but it was meant to protect me. I thanked her and ended the call and sat quietly for a long moment afterward. I knew this was the direction things were going now. That afternoon my daughter confronted me again. She demanded to know who I had been calling and what I was planning. I told her calmly that I was getting advice and protecting myself. She started crying and said I was abandoning her and choosing strangers over my own child. Those words cut deep, and I felt them settle in my chest. I wanted to comfort her and take it all back like I had so many times before. But I also knew that doing that would put me right back where I started. I told her softly that I loved her, but I could not keep living like this. She turned away from me and said I was heartless. I stood there alone in the room and let that word hang in the air. I knew it was not true, but it still hurt to hear it come from her. That evening, I packed the rest of my things slowly. I folded clothes and placed them in my bag and suitcase and took only what I truly needed. Each item felt like a small goodbye to the life I thought I had. I did not cry while I packed. I felt focused and steady. Before bed, I sat down and wrote in my notebook again. I wrote about fear and love and boundaries and how they can exist at the same time. I wrote that being a mother did not mean sacrificing my safety. Writing those words made them feel real. I lay down that night knowing that tomorrow something would finally break open. I did not know exactly how, but I could feel it coming. The house felt tense and heavy around me. I closed my eyes and reminded myself that whatever happened next, I was not wrong for choosing to live. I woke up early that morning with my heart beating faster than usual, and for a moment I stayed still trying to understand why. Then it all came back to me at once, and I knew this was not going to be a normal day. The air in the room felt heavy, and my body felt alert, like it was preparing for something important. I got dressed quietly and packed the last few things I needed. I folded my clothes carefully and placed them in my bag along with my notebook and papers. I took my time because rushing only made my hands shake more. When I was done, I sat on the bed and looked around the room that had been mine for so many years. I felt sadness, but I also felt clarity. When I stepped into the living room, my daughter was already awake. She was sitting on the couch scrolling on her phone, and she did not look up when I entered. Her boyfriend was in the kitchen making noise and acting like nothing was wrong. I stood there for a moment and realized how separate our worlds had become even though we were under the same roof. I told my daughter calmly that I was leaving for a few days to stay with a friend. She looked up at me then and her eyes narrowed. She asked why I was running away instead of fixing things. I told her quietly that I was not running. I was taking space to protect myself. She stood up and started raising her voice. She said I was being dramatic and selfish, and that I was tearing the family apart. Her boyfriend joined in and said I was making a big mistake. Their voices overlapped and filled the room, and I felt that familiar pressure in my chest again. This time I did not argue. I did not explain. I did not apologize. I simply picked up my bag and told them I would be back when things were calmer. Saying those words felt powerful because I meant them. I walked toward the door and felt my hands steady. As I opened it, as I stepped outside, my daughter followed me, and told me not to come back if I was going to act like this. Hearing that hurt more than I expected, and for a brief moment I hesitated. I thought about all the years I had spent putting her first and how easy it would be to turn around and stay. Instead, I kept walking. I locked the door behind me and stood on the mall porch for a second, letting the cool air hit my face. I felt scared and relieved at the same time. I knew this decision would change our relationship, and that truth sat heavy in my chest. But I also knew I could not survive if nothing changed. I went to my friend's house, and she welcomed me without questions. She made me something warm to eat, and insisted I sit down and rest. As I ate, I realized how hungry I had been, and that realization made my eyes fill with tears. I did not cry out loud. I just let the feeling pass through me. That evening, I called the legal aid office again, and told them I had left the house temporarily. They assured me I had done the right thing and explained the next steps I could take to protect my home and myself. Hearing their calm voices helped ground me. As night came, I sat alone in the guest room and wrote in my notebook. I wrote about how hard it was to choose myself, and how necessary it felt at the same time. I wrote about love and limits, and how one should never erase the other. Writing helped me breathe. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet around me. It felt different from the quiet at home. This quiet felt safe. I knew the road ahead would not be easy, and that there would be more confrontation and pain. But I also knew I had crossed another line, and I was not going back. I slept deeper than I had in weeks. The next morning I woke up in my friend's house, and for a moment I forgot where I was. The room was quiet and clean, and the air felt lighter. When I remembered everything that had happened, my chest tightened, but it did not feel like panic. It felt like reality settling in. My friend had already made breakfast and told me to eat as much as I wanted. I sat at the table and took slow bites, letting my body catch up to the moment. I realized how long it had been since I ate without stress sitting in my stomach. That simple act made me feel human again. Later that morning I stepped outside and sat on the porch. I watched cars pass and listened to birds in the trees. Life was moving forward whether I was ready or not. I reminded myself that leaving did not mean giving up. It meant creating space to think clearly. I received a call from the legal aid office before noon. They explained the next steps again and told me I could begin the process to reclaim my home safely. They spoke calmly and patiently, and that helped steady my nerves. I asked questions and wrote down notes in my notebook. I wanted to understand everything. After the call I sat quietly and thought about my house. I thought about the walls and the memories and the years I had poured into that place. The idea of confronting my daughter again made my stomach twist, but the idea of never going back felt worse. I knew I deserved my home back. That afternoon my daughter called me. Her voice was sharp at first, and she accused me of abandoning her. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her calmly that I needed safety and respect, and that I would not discuss anything while being yelled at. She hung up on me. I sat with that moment longer than I expected. It hurt deeply, but it also confirmed what I already knew. She was not ready to take responsibility. I could not wait for her to change while my health and peace disappeared. That evening I took a walk around the neighborhood with my friend. The movement helped loosen the tightness in my body. I realized how much stress I had been carrying, and how it had aged me. I promised myself I would not ignore my body again. Before bed, I reviewed my notes and documents one more time. I felt nervous but prepared. I understood now that protecting myself was not an act of anger. It was an act of self-respect. As I lay down that night, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the woman I used to be. The one who always stayed quiet. The one who sacrificed without limits. I knew she had done her best. But I also knew I was becoming someone stronger. Tomorrow I would take another step. And even though I was afraid, I was ready. The next day began with a phone call that made my hand shake even before I answered it. It was the legal aid office calling to let me know they were ready to move forward if I was. I sat at the small kitchen table in my friend's house, holding the phone close and listening carefully to every word. They explained the process slowly and clearly. They told me what papers would be filed and what notices would be sent. They reminded me that this was my home and that the law existed to protect people like me. Hearing it laid out that way made the situation feel real and final. There was no pretending anymore. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. I looked down at my hands and noticed how thin they looked. I thought about my age and my health, and how much energy this situation had already taken from me. I knew I could not afford to go back to living in fear. I called my daughter that afternoon because I believed she deserved to hear it from me directly. When she answered, her voice was guarded. I told her calmly that I was moving forward with legal steps to protect my income and my home. I told her this was not about punishment. It was about safety and survival. She exploded with anger. She accused me of betrayal and said I was choosing strangers over my own blood. She said I was heartless and cold and selfish. Each word landed hard and I felt my chest tighten, but I stayed steady. I reminded myself why I was doing this. I told her I loved her, but I would not continue to be mistreated. I told her taking my check and leaving me without food crossed a line that could not be ignored. She told me I was exaggerating and then hung up on me. The silence that followed felt loud, but I sat there staring at the wall and let myself feel the grief of that moment. Not just grief for the argument, but grief for the relationship I thought we had. I realized I was mourning a version of my daughter that no longer existed. That truth hurt deeply. Later that day, I returned to my house with a police escort arranged through the legal office. I did not want confrontation, and I wanted to stay safe. Walking up to my own front door felt surreal. I had lived there for decades, and now it felt unfamiliar. When the door opened, my daughter looked shocked to see me with someone else. Her boyfriend stood behind her, and his face hardened when he saw the officer. The officer explained calmly why they were there and what would happen next. I stayed quiet and let the process unfold. I went into my room and gathered more of my belongings. Each item felt heavy with memory. I did not rush. I moved slowly and deliberately because this was my life I was packing up piece by piece. I avoided looking at my daughter because I knew it would break my focus. As I walked out with my bags, I paused in the doorway and looked around one last time. I remembered birthday dinners and quiet evenings and years of work that paid for every wall and floor. I whispered goodbye under my breath and stepped outside. Back at my friend's house, I sat on the bed and finally let the tears come. They came quietly and steadily, not from weakness, but from release. I cried for what was lost and for what I was protecting. When the tears stopped, I felt exhausted but lighter. That night, I slept with my phone beside me and my bag at the foot of the bed. I knew the final steps were close now. The hardest part was almost over. Even though the road ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer invisible. The final days of that process passed slowly and quietly, and I welcomed that stillness. I stayed at my friend's house and focused on eating regularly and resting my body. Each small routine felt like a step back toward myself. I was tired, but I was no longer starving or afraid, and that mattered more than anything else. The legal office kept in touch with me and explained each update as it happened. They told me when notices were delivered and what timelines looked like. I listened carefully and asked questions because I wanted to understand everything. Knowledge made me feel less helpless and more grounded. Did not hear from my daughter during that time, and that silence was painful. There were moments when I picked up my phone wanting to call her and apologize just to make the discomfort stop. But then I remembered the hunger and the fear and the way my needs had been ignored. I put the phone down every time. When the day finally came to return to my home, I felt nervous but steady. I went with support and made sure everything was done safely. Walking back into my house felt different than I expected. It was quiet and empty, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like mine again. Moved slowly through each room and took deep breaths. I opened windows and let fresh air in. I cleaned surfaces and picked up small things that had been left behind. Each action felt symbolic, like I was reclaiming not just space but dignity. I sat down in my chair and rested my hands in my lap. I noticed how calm my body felt compared to before. The fear that once lived in my chest was gone. In its place was sadness mixed with relief and something else I had not felt in a long time. Peace. That evening I cooked a simple meal for myself and ate it at my own table. I did not rush. I did not feel watched. I felt present. I realized how basic safety and nourishment should never be negotiable, no matter who the other person is. Still think about my daughter and I still love her. That love did not disappear. But I now understand that love does not mean sacrificing my life or my health. Love can exist with boundaries and distance when necessary. As night fell, I turned off the lights and walked to my bedroom. I lay down and listened to the quiet of my own home. It felt unfamiliar and familiar at the same time. I knew healing would take time and that the pain would not vanish overnight. But I also knew something important. I survived. And this time I chose myself. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.